Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today we'll be continuing with the same lesson, that's a village cricket match. For the ones who have not watched it, kindly go back to my channel to watch this first part, or you can click on the link given below in the description box. And for the ones who have already watched it, let's continue with this wonderful lesson. In the meanwhile, things were happening below on the terrestrial sphere. Indeed, the situation was rapidly becoming what the French call movement. In the first place, the blacksmith forgot his sprained ankle and set out at a capital rate for the other end, roaring in a great voice as he went, "Come on, Joe!" The baker, who was running on behalf of the invalid, also set out, and he also roared, "Come on, Joe!" And side by side, like a pair of high-stepping hackneys, the pair cantered along. From the other end, Joe set out on his mission, and he roared, "Come on, Bill!" So all three came on, and everything would have been all right so far as the running was concerned, had it not been for the fact that Joe very naturally ran with his head thrown back and his eyes goggling at the hawk-like cricket ball. And this in itself would not have mattered if it had not been for the fact that the blacksmith and the baker also very naturally ran with their heads turned not only upwards but also backwards as well, so that they too gazed at the ball with an alarming sort of squint and a truly terrific kink in their necks. Halfway down the pitch, the three met with a magnificent clang, reminiscent of early happy days in the tournament ring at Ashby de la Zouch, and the hopes of the village fell with a resounding fall of their three champions. So, meanwhile, as the ball was in the air, in the ground, what was happening? So, in the first place, the blacksmith, he forgot that he had a sprained ankle, and he started running, and he started roaring in a great voice, "Come on, Joe!" He was talking to the other person. Now, the baker, who was running on behalf of the blacksmith, also started running. So, both of them started running like a pair of high stepping hackneys. Hackney meaning it's a stylish carriage horse breed. From the other end, the person named Joe, he too started running and he said, "Come on, Bill." So all three started running. Now everything would have been all right as far as the running was concerned. This man called Joe, he started running, looking backwards at the ball, and his eyes was staring at the ball, which was descending down from the air. Now this would have been still okay, but what happened was the blacksmith as well as the baker, both of them also were looking upwards as well as backwards towards the ball. So nobody saw each other coming, and at the middle of the ground, at the middle of the pitch, all three of them had a huge hit. All three collided with each other, and that collision reminded people of Ashby de la Zouch, that is a town in England, and they used to have some tournaments over there. The writer is describing that, and because of that collision, as the three champions they fell on the ground, the hopes of the crowd also fell with them. But what of the fielding side? Things were not so well with them. If there was doubt and confusion among the warriors of Ford and Den, there was also uncertainty and disorganization among the ranks of the invaders. Their main trouble was the excessive concentration of their force in the neighborhood of the wicket. Napoleon laid it down that it was impossible to have too many men upon a battlefield, and he used to do everything in his power to call up every available man for a battle. Mr. Hodge, after a swift glance at the ascending ball and a swift glance at the disposition of his troops, disagreed profoundly with the Emperor's dictum.
He had too many men, far too many, and all except the youth in the blue silk jumper and the mighty Boone were moving towards strategical positions underneath the ball, and not one of them appeared to be aware that any of the other existed. Boone had not moved because he was more or less in the right place. But then, Boone was not likely to bring off the catch, especially after the episode of the last ball. Major Hawker, shouting, "Mine, mine," in a magnificently self confident voice, was coming up from the bowler's end like a battle cruiser. Mr. Harcourt had obviously lost sight of the ball altogether, if indeed he had ever seen it, for he was running round and round Boone and giggling foolishly. Livingstone and Southcott, the two cracks, were approaching competently. Either of them would catch it easily. Mr. Hodge had not only to choose between them, and coming to a swift decision, he yelled above the din, "Yours, Livingstone!" Southcott, a disciplined cricketer, stopped dead. Then Mr. Hodge made a fatal mistake. He remembered Livingstone's two missed sitters, and he reversed his decision and roared, "Yours, Bobby!" Mr. Southcott obediently started again, while Livingstone, who had not heard the second order, went straight on. Captain Hodge had restored the status quo.
This was happening in the batting side. But now, what was happening on the fielding side? So things were not well with them too. Since there was confusion among the warriors of Ford and Den, that is the batting side, there was confusion between the people of London, the invaders who are protecting the other team. Now, the main trouble with their team was the focus on the ball. Napoleon, a very great leader, had stated it was impossible to have too many men in a battlefield. Like, how many people you have available men, bring them to the battle. But Mr. Hodge, the captain, he just looked at the ball which was falling from the air, and he looked at his team, and he disagreed with Napoleon's statement because he had many people right now. Now, everyone were running towards the positions where the ball might fall, except the youth in the blue jumper as well as Boone. They were almost standing in their own place. They were not moving. But the problem was all the people were running towards the position, but no one looked around that the other person is also running. They were all focused on the ball. Now, Boone had not moved because he was more or less in the right place. But Boone was not likely to bring off the catch. He was not about to catch it because after the episode of the last ball, what happened? He had caught a ball and he was hit by it and he was not interested. Now, Major Hawker, he started shouting, "Mine, mine," in a very confident voice. Now, Mr. Harcourt had obviously lost sight of the ball and he had not seen the ball also, might be. He was just running round and round Boone, and he was giggling, laughing foolishly. And Livingstone and Southcott, they are the two cracks, they too were approaching the ball. Now, either of them would catch it easily. Now, Mr. Hodge, the captain, had to choose between them, and he came to a decision. "Yours, Livingstone," he shouted. So, Southcott, he was a very disciplined cricketer and he stopped. He followed what the captain said. Then immediately the captain made a mistake. What he did is he remembered Livingstone's two missed sitters. He had missed two times before. And then immediately he reversed his decision and he said, "Yours, Bobby." He said to Southcott, "You go ahead." And Southcott, he was a very obedient cricketer and he followed the captain's order. But Southcott had heard it, but Livingstone did not hear the second order. So he too was running. Even Southcott started running towards the position where the ball would have fallen.
In the meantime, the professor of ballistics had made a lightning calculation of angles, velocities, density of the air, barometer readings, and temperatures, and had arrived at the conclusion that the critical point, the spot which ought to be marked in the photographs with an X, was 1 yard to the northeast of Boone, and he proceeded to take up station here, colliding on the way with Donald and knocking him over. A moment later, Bobby Southcott came racing up and tripped over the recumbent Donald and was shot head first into the Abraham-like bosom of Boone. Boone stepped backward under the impact and came down with his spiked boot upon the professor's toe. Almost simultaneously, the portly wicket-keeper, whose movements were a positive triumph of the spirit over the body, bumped the professor from behind. The learned man was thus neatly sandwiched between Tweedledum and Tweedledee, and the sandwich was instantly converted into a rag out by Livingstone, who made up for his lack of extra weight, for he was always in perfect training by his extra momentum. And all the time, Mr. Shakespeare Pollock hovered alertly upon the outskirts like a rugby scrum half, screaming American University cries in a piercingly high tenor voice.
So now, in the meantime, all this was happening. The professor of ballistics, he started making lightning calculations, very fast calculations of angles, velocities, density of the air, everything he calculated, and he came to a conclusion that the ball would fall on a spot which is 1 yard to the northeast of Boone. So he started running towards that place so that he stands there and catches the ball. Now, when he was running towards that place, he collided on the way with Donald and knocking him over. He fell down. Now, a moment later, even Bobby Southcott, he started running towards that position to catch the ball, and he collided with Donald, who had fallen down, and he tripped. Southcott tripped. And when he tripped, he hit his head first into the bosom, chest of Boone. And Boone, because of that impact, he stepped backwards. And when he stepped backwards, his spiked boot stepped on the professor's toe. So now the wicket keeper, the portly, the fat wicket keeper, he too started running towards them, and he bumped or he dashed the professor from behind. Now this learned man, professor, he was sandwiched between them, the Tweedledum and Tweedledee. What do you mean by that is any two persons or things that differ only slightly from each other are called Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Like two of a kind, you can say twins, almost similar. There's very slight difference between them. Now this sandwich was instantly converted into a rag out by Livingstone, because he too started running towards that same place and he too dashed them. Shakespeare Pollock, he was just running around there and he was screaming in a very high voice.
At last, the ball came down. To Mr. Hodge, it seemed a long time before the invention of Sir Isaac Newton finally triumphed, and it was a striking testimony to the mathematical and ballistical skill of the professor that the ball landed with a sharp report upon the top of his head. Thence, it leapt up into the air a foot or so, cannoned on to Boone's head, and then trickled slowly down the colossal expanse of the wicket-keeper's back, bouncing slightly as it reached the massive lower portions. It was only a foot from the ground when Mr. Shakespeare Pollock sprang into the vortex with a last ear-splitting howl of victory and grabbed it off the seat of the wicket-keeper's trousers. The match was a tie, and hardly anyone on the field knew it except Mr. Hodge, the youth in the blue jumper, and Mr. Pollock himself. For the two batsmen and the runner, undaunted to the last, had picked themselves up and were bent on completing the single that was to give Fordenden the crown of victory. Unfortunately, dazed with their falls, with excitement, and with the noise, they all three ran for the same wicket, simultaneously realized their error, and all three turned and ran for the other. The blacksmith, ankle and all, in the center, leading by the yard, so that they looked like pictures of the Russian troika. But their effort was in vain, for Mr. Pollock had grabbed the ball and the match was a tie.
Now, finally, the ball came down. Now, for the captain, Mr. Hodge, it looked as if it took a very long time to come down, and it was a great striking testimony to the mathematical and ballistical skill of the professor that the ball had landed at the same position that he had decided upon the top of his head. So he was on the right place. Now, as they were all sandwiched, it leapt up into the air a foot or so, so it cannoned onto Boone's head and then came down towards the wicket keeper's back, bouncing slightly as it reached the lower portions. So it was only a foot from the ground when Mr. Shakespeare Pollock he caught the ball. So the match was a tie, and hardly anyone knew about it except Mr. Hodge, the youth in the blue jumper, and Mr. Pollock himself. In the pitch, the three batsmen had fallen down. So the two batsmen and the runner. Now they picked themselves up and they went on completing the single that could give Ferdinand the crown of victory. But again, what happened? Because of the excitement and noise, they all three ran for the same wicket towards the same side. And immediately they realized their error, their mistake, and they turned around and all three started running towards the other end together. So all three started running towards the same wicket. But their effort was in vain. It was useless because Mr. Pollock had grabbed the ball, he had caught the ball, and the match was a tie.
And both the teams spent the evening at the Three Horseshoes, and Mr. Harcourt made a speech in Italian about the glories of England and afterwards fell asleep in a corner. And Donald got home to Royal Avenue at 1 o'clock in the morning, feeling that he had not learned very much about the English from his experience of their national game.
So now the match was over, and both the teams spent the evening at the Three Horseshoes, the cafe. And Mr. Harcourt made a speech in Italian about the glories of England and afterwards fell asleep in a corner. And Donald, he got home to Royal Avenue at 1 o'clock in the morning, and he felt that he had not learned much about the national game of England. He felt he has not learned anything. He did not gain any experience. So that brings to the end of this chapter. I do hope you have understood this funny, humorous story. In case you have any doubts, you can comment below. And to watch more interesting videos, you can subscribe to my channel. Thank you and stay safe.